I realize that if each state could get on the same page and wavelength as the federal level when it comes to laws for victims of domestic minor sex trafficking, it really would be a safer place. But each state is just, it's like they're fighting it because they don't want to believe it or they don't want to admit it. And they just want to continue letting the buyers that have a home and a good paying job and is doing great in his life, he can't have a stain on his record, but these bad girls that are, or even boys on the streets, can continue being criminalized.
Hello, and welcome to Invading the Darkness, stories from the fight against child sex trafficking, featuring Linda Smith, the founder of Shared Hope International. Join Linda as she shares stories from her 23 years of fighting the battle of domestic minor sex trafficking. Our desire is that each episode of Invading the Darkness will help you understand the importance of fighting child sex trafficking, as well as equip you to join in that fight. This episode is part 3 in a 3-part series of Yvonne's personal story.
I didn't know and didn't realize that once you have a record of any kind, they're going to treat you tougher. There's reasons for that. And the way hers was aligned to be a violent criminal from when she was defending herself against that 81-year-old buyer who was beating her up. Every time that anybody would look her up, she was perceived to be violent. Well, she had been pretty angry for a lot of years, but she was not violent. We had no reason to think that she was violent, and she had been a very, very good employee. But talk about that night and maybe what you learned from that. Maybe you knew all that. I got an education that night. And then what happened?
Yeah, Linda. So one of my many embarrassing moments with you. Yeah. So I had been with Shared Hope for, I believe it was a year at that point. I had taken in a gal and she ended up having a miscarriage. And I did a lot of single parenting classes with the church. So I did volunteer with the church. And I was a leader. And so I took in one of these gals and she ended up having a miscarriage from being in a domestic violence relationship with her boyfriend. When that had happened, she was with me in a safe place. Of course, I worked, so she was home alone a lot. And she just could not take the loneliness. She actually ended up going back to the guy. So when I got home that night, I realized where she was. So I went back to either talk to her or at least get my house key back, because at this point I did not feel comfortable with her mental state and her returning back to this boyfriend. Him and I got into an argument because he didn't want me taking his girl away, and he pushed me out the front door and shut the door on my hands, on my fingers. And I bumped it with my shoulder because, of course, it hurt. And I guess the door had been kicked in so many times from previous drug people that the door just came off the hinges. I didn't even push it that hard. And so I went home and the cops came to my house, and I was honest with them. I was like, it was a verbal altercation. When he slammed the door on my fingers, I just pushed at the door because, it hurt. And so they said, okay, so you pushed the door back open? I was like, well, obviously, yes. And they said, get up, put your hands behind your back. So I admitted to basically residential burglary, which I was appalled that they were even doing that. I went into jail that night, and I have a residential burglary charge on me. That is a strike, okay? That is a felony offense strike. I'm kind of freaking out a little bit. I hadn't been in trouble in years, but because of my criminal history and because of looking in my past, I'm a violent offender. So obviously I lost it that night and tried to go into the house and, beat everybody up, which is not what happened. Anyways, I went to court and the judge dropped the residential burglary charge to a misdemeanor of trespassing and DV. So I actually got off on that charge, I guess you could say. And in all reality, I should have never went to the house. I shouldn't have done any of that. However, I was just thinking about I have stuff at the house. I have my kids are there. My mom, she's elderly and she's there. And I just didn't want this, girl coming back and especially with her boyfriend and just doing whatever, so I just handled that very not well. And so I learned a lot of lessons from that. All in all, I got probation and community service, and it wasn't really all that bad. I ended up being treated fairly for the charge that I had, trespassing and domestic violence, and I pled guilty to that. But it went from the extreme of residential burglary because of who I was to, the lesser charge that's a misdemeanor. However, if you were to do the background check, the residential burglary still comes up, and I actually have to show the paper where they rescinded that charge. It's an awkward scenario, very embarrassing. I'm actually still friends with the girl now. She's come a long ways. She's doing very well for herself, and she is definitely a different person today. But, I saw that in her when I first met her, so I knew that there was something good in her because I knew there was something good in me. And so loving others the way that I needed to be loved is what carries me through and gets me through. And that's why I continue to help other people.
I love watching from the very early time your love for other people, that this diversion into being homeless as a child, to being violated, and then your prison time, and just everything that had happened had been turned into something that you immediately turned into grace. You cared about other people. I think the big issue for us at Shared Hope was that you had to be told repeatedly, you make sure that you keep the environment for your children safe. You've got these issues of getting the back. You don't have any wiggle room at all. So some things you just don't get to do. And one is to not think through your action. And I think some of that was spontaneous, but it was really funny because they also came to me. Sheila said, well, what do we do? Everybody knows us. Well, that's good because that should help her. But she said, I realize that thinking forward, she didn't do like she could have done, like she usually is, like the ordinary Yvonne. And I think, Yvonne, they decided that the days you served in jail, you would not be paid was the penalty. Does that sound right?
That is correct, yes. And I gladly accepted that penalty.
So sometimes you have a penalty for action, but it needs to scale. And so often the penalty for action or lack of action by pimps, traffickers, and parents that were from trafficking their children, that they don't understand reasonable, measured accountability. And so even learning and understanding and taking responsibility became, I'd say you got to graduate level in it. Every once in a while, though, she would need a letter. I think actually to rent, you maybe needed letters. Go ahead and talk about housing for you, because we have a federal housing bill now that encourages considering the conditions around a trafficked individual, that you don't necessarily count those and discount them. It also connects to your credit rating. Be sure that you think about the trafficking before you deny housing because of a search on their background. But go ahead.
So a couple of times I needed to get into a rental, and I had asked either Linda or the HR department to please write a letter of my conduct and character so that I could get into the rental. When I had moved to Texas to church plant, that was another time that I had asked for an updated character reference on my behalf so that I could find a rental in Texas, because now I'm in a whole nother state that I'm not normally from. And so they have no bearings to look at to see, okay, who is this person? And so, you guys graciously did write me a letter. I appreciate that. And I was able to get into housing or find a decent rental that I could get into that was a safe environment for our family. so that we could start fresh and plant the church that we moved down here for and go full force into that. But it's hard, I shouldn't have to keep asking for letters to do things. But at the same time, I am blessed that I do have the character references and the people in my life to write those. It's just always mind-boggling sometimes that I have to prove who I am.
So we've added in the advanced framework some very poignant pieces of law that have been passed by some in other forms, some states, but to make them consistent in all states and to assure that the states that don't protect the child as a victim of trafficking, that still call them prostitutes in the law, that still allow a man to say, I didn't know how old she was, really walk, because knowledge of what he knew, that's a little bit of a higher bar to pass, and assures that the defense attorney can bring in to the beginning of any part of the criminal justice system, the fact that this is a child under 18 in commercial sex and that they are considered by the federal law, and we want it in every state, to be a victim of trafficking. Now, neither of those settle it. The buyer might have other defenses for why he bought. There might be other things around the trial that explain issues in the trafficking of the child. But at least we can put this in context of the state's trafficking law and align it to the federal laws. So the first part is to get those laws. There are 7 policy goals in the very first point. There are 6 overall issue briefs. And under those, there are a variety of points that we want addressed. So today, you and I have talked about the defense of age, which is what is often used to skate through to safety, causes them to be allowed to go out the back room, puts the burden of proof on the child, or at least the child's attorney, to prove they had to know how old they were, when the simple fact is the trafficking law needs to be very clear that children under 18 are trafficked victims, and that any man buying a trafficked victim is involved in sex trafficking. So those are some of the very first points in the law that we want to tie up. Zeffie's caught between a variety of laws in Texas. The most states have already changed. The second point that really makes sense is identification. Do it early. What if you had been identified as a victim, even if they didn't have the trafficking law, of rape? See, because if they'd identified that as rape, instead of you as a runaway child or a prostitute, that man would automatically have been arrested. Yes, he was in the hospital for a while, but for attempted rape or rape of a child. Now, the laws in all states is we have a trafficking law, and children under 18 that are used in commercial sex are victims of trafficking. Oh, but maybe not. Maybe we should let the guy buying them have an excuse. I don't know how she was. Or maybe the girl won't give up who the trafficker really is because she's terrified. Or the little boy thinks that those men will get him again. Should they have to have the burden of the whole trial placed on them? Nope. Right up front. Identify the victim. The response needs to be to give them protection, safety, counseling, trauma care, treat them as the victim they are. And then if you want to look at the other things the traffickers are done or the other conditions, fine, but treat them as a victim. Don't just stick them in jail, as some states are saying, well, we'll just put them in jail first and then we'll figure it out. That's a good way to do it, or the best way to do it. And I say, no, the pimps already told them they're criminal, already told them that they're bad. And when they get picked up, they're going to go to jail. They're just a whore. Guess what? You put them in jail, you reaffirm what the pimp has said, and everyone has lied to him and not believed him. Believe the child to begin with. What risk do you have to believe, if they're in commercial sex, there's a buyer, there's a seller, or either one, that the child is any danger to society?
The fact that we even have to defend our children and stand up for them to tell the system how to treat our children still kind of is mind-boggling to me, because it shouldn't be like that. It should automatically be, no, this child was going to be raped. This child was going to be molested. This child was going to be kidnapped. But instead, because money's brought to the table, no, this child is a prostitute, is a paid working thing, or this child had a boyfriend, so there's a relationship there. So there's all these loopholes, I guess, to continue with the same bias that has been going on since the beginning of time, basically. But the thing is that they're children. They are children. Half the time, these children aren't even legal age to even work at a regular job. So how can you say that they can legally make up their own mind if they want to engage in sex or not? When if there's no money at the table, it's automatically rape or molestation or statutory rape. But as long as money's brought to the table, it's a whole new, it's a job now. Well, half the time these kids aren't even old enough to do their own taxes or to even have their own employment, to work at McDonald's or Subway, where most teenagers could go, but you have to be 16 or above. And some of these children that are being trafficked are younger than that. It's just mind-boggling to me that we are in the 2000s here and we are still fighting for our children, that they are victims.
Yeah, as you start looking and you go through the real facts, you have just said the mind-boggling issue that just by labeling the child, they're denied all of the services, intervention, and help that they would have got had they not been labeled a prostitute. Wow. So a guy goes to the ATM, he gets the money out, he goes to where he's found he's supposed to go by the text that he got or the online address. He shows up there with the gummy worms. Actually, this is a real case. Shows up with the gummy worms on top of the gummy worm milkshake because he finds out online in this sting that that's what the 13-year-old wants. Shows up, thinks he's going to buy a 13-year-old. Now, in that case, there's not even a real kid. There is just the practice of saying, don't have to hurt the kids first. Let's do investigations that get these guys out and arrested and make sure that they simply come under trying to obtain a child. So all of the words, some would say, well, no, not really, because it wasn't really a child. So we're making sure in the law that every state considers these investigations by law enforcement to try to, they don't bait them, but they start picking up people that are out there shopping. And they will watch them and then place an ad, but not bait them. And then try to say, do you know how old this child is? Or they'll try to say, you know how old I am? I can't get cigarettes. So would you bring me some? Oh, okay. So they come and bring them cigarettes. They know then that they knew they were a child. So they're not baiting. These are the kinds of cases that make sure that they stopped hurting other children. But those for the defense would say, no, if they don't hurt a child first, they don't go ahead and buy, and there's not a real victim, then they're not involved in trafficking. That's another change in the law that we want to be consistent throughout the United States. Some states have changed that. Some haven't. Otherwise, raise the bar so a law to protect children really is enforced without another victimization along the way and an excuse for the buyer.
I realize that if each state could get on the same page and wavelength as the federal level when it comes to laws for victims of domestic minor sex trafficking, it really would be a safer place. But each state is just, it's like they're fighting it because they don't want to believe it or they don't want to admit it. And they just want to continue letting the buyers that have a home and a good paying job and is doing great in his life, you know, he can't have a stain on his record, but these bad girls that are, or even boys on the streets can continue being criminalized. It's just a backwards way of thinking, you know?
Another area that I think is vitally important, and I've talked a little bit about it, is the financial brunt of all of this should not continue to be on young women like Yvonne. And often the players that have money also, yes, the buyers do, but are the facilitators, passive and aggressive. Some are right in there and they help to facilitate. Some are kind of just saying, well, I know it's happening, but we want to make sure that there's an ability to take people's assets, facilitators, and that money go to people they've hurt. We need to increase those laws in the state, make them clearer, and make a path for restoration with the money that was made by selling these kids. We're seeing some good things happening, and I'll be telling you about some of them later, where one attorney took after for 2 or 3 little girls a strip joint, got the managers, got the owners, and the girls got money for restoration. We need more of those. But with clear laws, you'll see more attorneys taking on those cases.
Well, one thing I know with traffickers or even with men that are manipulative is you could tell a girl that it's not that bad to take off your clothes so I could take a picture of you and sell it. You know, that's not bad. You know, and when the girl really thinks about the bigger picture, at least she's not on the street or she's not in the club and she's in the privacy of a bedroom per se. There is safety in that. So then the girl complies because she thinks that's safer than anything else, not knowing what's going to happen next. So she's already said yes to one dirty deed, and now the manipulator has her hooked from there because once she said yes, she can't say no to anything else because he can hold anything over her head. And I'm just saying he, she here because that's a more common aspect. It happens to boys as well, and women can be traffickers as well. With that being said, you know, there's girls that they're walking down the street and there's already communication with a gentleman and they're building a relationship. And then one day there's maybe a fight at home or something. And the male friend comes to the rescue as the girl's walking down the street and says, hey, get in the car. You know, let's just get out of here for a minute. The girl willingly gets in the car, not knowing she's being manipulated and will probably never see her family again. So now she's kidnapped. But because there's a relationship built and that's my boyfriend, and in her mind, he even tells her, but you got in the car. I didn't kidnap you. You weren't stolen. You got in the car willingly. See the manipulation piece there? So it's just gut-wrenching that the manipulation piece is there, but the authorities have to fight so hard to prove that it was there in order to protect the victims. And 9 times out of 10, it's just hard to prove that. And so the victims become classified as criminals, and they're the ones that are involved and doing it themselves.
One of the times, you know, the later part of your time in and out of prison, because you were raised in the prison. You were a kid raised in prison, was getting caught up as you exited without a whole lot of the more brutal difficulties, but being set up even in prison, then being captive to a guerrilla pimp. Can you talk about that? I'm going to describe all the kinds of pimps so nobody thinks they're all lover boys. And I'm going into more of the violence, but you don't have to do that if you're uncomfortable with it, or we can.
So I was actually in my early 20s. I had been released from prison and I didn't have the skills to make it in the real world. So I went back to what was comfortable, which was doing drugs. And I ended up doing like a probation violation in the county jail. The one thing I did do was move counties. I got released to a whole nother county so that I wasn't going back to my old county. I thought I'd have a better chance then, right? But I just had the same old life. Well, while I was in county jail, a group of ladies had talked with me and stuff and faked a friendship. And I'll get to that later. So they knew I was getting out, and the one gal said, "Hey, I need you to go to my house. You'll be safe there. And then when I get out, we'll pursue a future together of either getting high or still being friends or whatever it was." So I did. When I got out, I went to her house, knocked on the door, and her so-called husband answered. And come to find out, it was not her husband. I got played basically. When I went into the house, he was a brutal, mean man, very, very big, tall. And at first he played the nice guy, and I don't know, I was just tricked and conned basically. I ended up being tied in a basement, being beat, being sold, and it just all happened so fast and so quick, and I didn't even realize what had happened. I did not know I was being tricked. I didn't know any of that, and I was so mad at myself for it too. Later on found out that's a gorilla pimp. They beat you, and that's how they use power and control to coerce you to do what they want. And it's very brutal, very violent, and it does a lot of damage to the mind, way worse than what I had grown up to and was accustomed and used to. So I ended up finally being able to run, and I got locked up again for drug charges and more violations. And so I intentionally got in a fight during lunchtime and beat the girl on the head with her lunch tray so that I could be thrown in the hole and moved from that county back to actual prison, which was a whole 5 hours, 6 hours away from where I was, so that I can get out of the situation of where I was at. So, because it seemed like no matter where I went, his name was Harley. He could find me. He would bring me back. One of the times that he had me with him, he brought this girl in, and she had actually been somebody that was under his control from previously. So when she came into the picture, she was just deathly scared. And she had already been in that situation before with him. So in a way, it made me scared because I didn't think I could run. If he brought her back and found her, then he could do the same to me. It was just scary. So yes, I intentionally got in a fight in the holding of where I was in the one county so that I could be transferred 6 hours away to the actual prison and finish out my time so that when I got released, he could not find me.
Thank you. I know that was a hard one. I think you say it's just embarrassing. You go, oh, how come I did that? Most of us don't know what's happening when someone's trying to trick us. We're in a place we've never been. And I think you're pretty smart to have figured out how to get away. I never would have, but I don't. You had a lot of years in prison and you learned a lot and you're smart. I used to think when I actually still do, you're definitely a survivor, and all those skills mean she can do things many of you that are listening and I wouldn't have the tolerance or the ability to do, the stamina, or I'll get through this too. She has a doctorate in that, and I really do admire you, Yvonne. Well, today we're going to take a rest now. Very likely when we get back into some of the federal law changes or some of the things that have to happen for there to be justice for people like her, we're going to talk about, can I have a career? Do I get to if I have a background like that, if I was labeled a prostitute? Which ones can I really have now? And the serious, serious damage that is done long term to the futures and the hopes of these children.
Thank you for listening to Invading the Darkness, stories from the fight against child sex trafficking. If you would like to learn how you can help put an end to child sex trafficking, please visit sharedhope.org/take action. New episodes of Invading the Darkness are released every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating as well as a written review. Join us in Episode 8 and learn how fighting demand is the best way to demand justice for the victims and survivors of child sex trafficking.